Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are attempting to get our heads around one of the biggest paradoxes in all of evolution, self-sacrifice.
It really is the central question, isn't it? How can natural selection, a force that's all about individual survival, survival of the fittest, possibly lead to cooperation or even outright suicidal altruism?
Exactly. It seems like it should be impossible. We're diving deep into Chapter 5 of E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology to tackle this, looking at selection that happens between the individual and the species.
Right, and the goal is to explain how altruism, which is by definition an act that lowers your own chances of survival and reproduction, can somehow be a winning strategy.
To really frame this, we can start at the absolute extreme of individualism. I'm thinking of Paavo Nurmi, the legendary Finnish runner.
Oh, yeah.
Someone asked him if he ran for his country, for Finland, and his answer was just perfect. He said, "No, I ran for myself, not for Finland. Above all, not then." At the Olympics, Paavo Nurmi mattered more than ever.
That's it. That is pure, unadulterated individual selection in a nutshell. The self above all else.
And then, if you go to the complete opposite pole, the ultimate expression of the group, you have the message the Apollo's II astronauts left on the moon.
We came in peace for all mankind.
From "I run for myself" to "we came for all mankind." Our mission today is to map that huge territory in between. We're going to look at the precise mechanics, the genetics, the math, that allow a group to win out over individual greed.
And to do that, we have to start with a really precise definition of the key term here, altruism.
Right, because in everyday language, it just means being nice.
Exactly. But in genetics, it's very specific. Altruism is the surrender of personal genetic fitness, so a direct cost to you for the enhancement of personal genetic fitness in others. It has to be a net loss for the actor.
So we're not talking about, abstract human kindness. We're talking about a measurable evolutionary trade-off, a genetic loss for you, a genetic gain for your neighbor.
That's the idea.
Okay, so we'll structure this by mapping out the different levels of selection. Then we'll spend some serious time on the pretty complex models that try to make this work mathematically, and then finally test it all against what we actually see in the animal kingdom. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. So when we talk about this kind of collective behavior, the first thing to recognize is that natural selection doesn't just work on one organism at a time. It can and does operate at the group level.
And that's what we call group selection, right? When selection affects a whole group 2 or more members as a single unit.
Exactly. And right away, we have to talk about the different scales, the different kinds of groups.
So starting just a step above the individual, you've got the most closely related groups. Siblings, parents, and their kids, that kind of thing.
That's kin selection. It's a term J. Maynard Smith coined back in 1964, but honestly, the idea goes all the way back to Darwin. It just means that selection is acting on an individual in a way that helps genes they share with their relatives.
So you're not acting for yourself, you're acting for the part of your genome that's also in your brother or your kids.
Precisely. Now, if you go to the other end of the spectrum, you have groups that aren't defined by family ties, but more by, say, geography. A breeding population.
Oh, yeah.
That's interdemic selection. The whole breeding population, or deme, is the unit of selection. And here, populations that have different genetic makeups, well, they either die out at different rates or they're better or worse at sending out colonists to start new populations.
So on one end, you have kin selection, small group, super high relatedness. On the other end, you have interdemic selection, bigger group, lower relatedness. So where do they meet?
That's the crucial question. They meet in a kind of transition zone. The sources suggest this happens when the group size is somewhere between, say, 10 and 100 individuals.
10 to 100. Why that specific range? What's so special about that number?
Well, it seems to hit a few different biological limits at the same time. For one, it's pretty much the maximum size for a big extended family that still has a really high average relatedness.
Okay, so kin selection is still a big factor there.
A huge factor. Second, it's about the upper limit on how many individuals an intelligent animal, like a primate or a wolf, can actually remember and have real personal bonds with.
So memory is a constraint. And I think you mentioned a third reason, a genetic one. It's about something called the effective population number, or $9.
That's the big one. 9 isn't just the head count, it's the number of breeding individuals that matters for genetic drift. And in that 10 to 100 range, a group is small enough that random chance genetic drift can fix certain genes really fast.
Including an altruism gene.
This creates these highly different little populations, these demes, that group selection can then act upon. Once you get much bigger than 100, drift becomes a much weaker force.
So the real action is focused on individuals, their kin, and these small, fast turnover populations. But just to be clear, why aren't we talking about selection at the level of the whole species? I mean, the extinction of the dinosaurs was a selection event, right?
It was, but it's a completely different timescale. That's a macroevolutionary process. It's way too slow to evolve a trait like altruism.
What do you mean?
Look, an altruism gene is constantly being beaten by selfish genes within any given population. For group selection to work, it has to wipe out the groups of selfish individuals faster than the selfish individuals can wipe out the altruists inside the groups.
So you need a really high turnover rate. Groups have to be dying out all the time.
Constantly. Individual selection is fast. It happens every generation. New species or whole ecosystems, they just don't pop into existence or go extinct fast enough for that kind of evolutionary testing. The force of group selection has to be on the same order of magnitude as individual selection, and that only really happens with these small, fragile little populations.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's focus in on that mechanism, on interdemic selection. You said this requires thinking about something called a metapopulation.
Right. This is a concept from Richard Levins in 1970. He said, don't think of one big population. Think of it more like a mold spreading across a checkerboard. There are all these habitable patches. At any time, a patch is either occupied by a population or it's empty.
So populations are just constantly popping up in empty patches and then dying out, leaving them empty again.
Winking in and out of existence, exactly. And this setup allows us to actually start modeling it with math.
Okay, let's try it. So if peoples is the proportion of patches that are occupied.
Right, people at time. We can describe the whole system with just a few key numbers. In DT, the migration or colonization rate, and E, the extinction rate.
And the change over time, the DPTT, is basically a balance between new colonies being formed and old ones dying off.
That's it. The equation looks like DTTT equal MP1P EPT. The first part, the MP, L.MP, that's the colonization, it depends on the migration rate. How many patches are already occupied and can send out migrants, and how many are empty and available to be colonized, 1P.
And then you just subtract the ones that are going extinct, the EP part.
Simple as that. And this leads to a really powerful conclusion about whether the whole system can even survive.
Okay.
At equilibrium, when things are stable, colonization has to equal extinction. So DPDT is 0. And that happens when the proportion of occupied patches is PP equals 1 MM.
Wait, so if E, the extinction rate, is bigger than M, the migration rate, the whole thing collapses.
The whole thing collapses. PBT goes to 0. The metapopulation can only persist if E is less than M. If you're dying out faster than you can find new homes, you're doomed.
That sets the stage for the whole system. But you said the type of altruism that gets selected for depends on when the extinction happens.
Exactly. We can think about the classic population growth curve. It starts slow, shoots up fast, that's the R phase, and then levels off as it hits the carrying capacity, K.
And extinction is most likely at the very beginning or after it hits the top and crashes.
Right, so you have R extinction at the beginning when the little group of colonists is really vulnerable, and you have K extinction later when the population overshoots its resources and crashes.
So if the main pressure is R extinction happening early on, what kind of behavior does that favor?
It favors pioneer traits. Anything that helps that brand new group get established and grow fast. So we're talking about things like clustering for defense, cooperative hunting, all focused on maximizing that growth rate are.
And these early groups are probably all close relatives, right?
Almost certainly, which means it's really hard to separate this from kin selection. They're all tangled up together.
Okay, but what if the main pressure is K extinction? The group survives the early phase, but then crashes from success.
Then the selection pressure flips completely. It favors what Wilson calls urban qualities, self-restraint, traits that keep the population below the danger level. So underusing resources, controlling your own birth rate, mutual aid might even be less important here than just personal restraint.
The source is mentioned in aphid that actually shows both of these pressures.
The Terracoma aphid. It's a perfect example. Their brand new little colonies are super vulnerable to R extinction. A single spider can wipe them out. But their older, bigger colonies are prone to K extinction. They boom, attract predators, exhaust the plant, and then the whole thing crashes. The group needs different behaviors to survive at different times.
It's fascinating how this all developed over time. This wasn't a brand new idea with Wilson.
Not at all. The thread really starts with J.B.S. Haldane back in 1932. He sort of dimly saw how this could work in small groups, but he was missing a key piece.
And what was that?
He missed differential population extinction. He and later Sewell Wright, with his famous island model, they focused on groups diverging and then sending out more colonists. They thought the altruistic groups would just outbreed the selfish ones,
But they weren't thinking about the selfish groups actually dying off completely.
which is the most powerful force. If the selfish individuals are always winning inside the group, you need a mechanism to get rid of those groups entirely and fast to keep the altruism gene from just vanishing everywhere.
So then you get ecologists like Kalela in the 50s looking at voles and talking about reproductive restraint.
Right, and he was crucial because he linked the two ideas. He said, yes, groups without self-control get wiped out. That's K extinction. But he also noted that these groups are basically just big extended families. So interdemic selection and kin selection are happening at the same time.
And that all leads up to the person who really just threw a bomb into the whole debate, V.C. Wynne-Edwards in 1962.
He's the one who took this idea to its absolute logical extreme. He argued that animals voluntarily sacrifice their own fitness through what he called social conventions.
He's like, what?
Lowering their own fertility, accepting a lower status, even abandoning their own young, all to keep the population from crashing. He was focused almost entirely on K extinction.
He also had this idea, epideictic displays. What are those?
He thought things like big bird flocks or insect swarms weren't just random gatherings. He believed they were a way for the animals to take a census, to communicate the population density to each other.
And if the density was too high, they should all just voluntarily reproduce less.
That was his claim, that social behavior exists primarily to regulate population size through voluntary sacrifice.
It sounds a little too neat. And I know it was pretty quickly attacked by critics, especially G.C. Williams.
Williams's critique was just devastating. He pointed out the obvious flaw. What if a cheater shows up? An individual who sees the high density but just doesn't restrain itself.
It would have more offspring than everyone else.
And its cheating genes would spread like wildfire. The whole system of voluntary restraint collapses. Williams showed that you could explain most of Wynne-Edwards' examples with simple individual selection, but it left this huge question hanging.
Could group selection ever win? And if so, what were the exact mathematical conditions needed to beat the power of individual selfishness?
And that's what takes us to the formal models. The theorists had to respond. The first big step came from Richard Levins, who focused on the R extinction scenario, where survival is all about getting established fast.
Okay, the math here gets pretty dense, so let's try to break it down conceptually. He wasn't tracking individuals, he was tracking the proportion of populations that had a certain amount of the altruist gene.
That's the key shift. Think of it like a big bucket of marbles. Each marble is a population, and its color represents the frequency of altruists inside it. Levins was modeling how the distribution of colors in the bucket changes over time.
And that change depended on three competing forces. Force 1 is extinction.
Right. The more altruists you have in a population, the lower its extinction rate, EX. That's the positive force of group selection.
Force 2 is new colonies being founded.
Yes, migrants go out and start new populations, and the gene frequency in those new groups is basically a random sample from the whole metapopulation. That's how the gene spreads around.
And then Force 3, the big one, is individual selection inside each population.
And that's the counteracting force. Inside every single one of those marbles, the altruist gene is being pushed down towards zero because altruists are at a disadvantage.
So Levins's breakthrough was to not try and solve the whole thing, but just to ask, if we start with almost no altruists, will the gene spread or will it be crushed?
Exactly, a stability analysis. And to visualize it, you can imagine a graph where the extinction rate of a population goes down as the frequency of altruists goes up. The strength of group selection is how fast that line drops.
So what did he find? Are the conditions easy to meet or are they really strict?
Incredibly stringent. He found that even if the group selection force is stronger than the individual selection force, the best you can usually hope for is polymorphism.
Meaning they just coexist, the altruists and the selfish individuals.
Right. The group selection is strong enough to keep the altruism gene from being wiped out completely, but it's rarely strong enough to make it take over the whole population. It just acts as a brake.
So it's feasible, but really, really hard.
Feasible, but the conditions are strict. So that was Levins, focusing on R extinction. Then you get the Boorman-Levitt model, which tackled the K extinction problem Wynne-Edwards' scenario.
And they set it up differently, right?
Yeah. Very differently. They imagined a big, stable central population that acts as a genetic source, and then a bunch of small, fragile, marginal populations that are constantly going extinct.
And they made a key simplifying assumption.
A huge one. They basically said extinction happens so fast in those marginal populations that you can just ignore individual selection within them. Group selection is the only game in town. This let them test Wynne-Edwards' idea in its purest form.
So under those conditions, what did they find was the secret ingredient for group selection to work?
They found it required a very specific and kind of weird relationship between altruism and survival. It had to be a step function.
A step function, you mean like an on-off switch?
Exactly. A gradual benefit doesn't work. The altruists have to provide almost no benefit at all until their frequency crosses some sharp threshold, some tipping point, and then, boom, they provide the maximum benefit.
Can you give an analogy for that?
Sure, think about building a dam to stop a flood. If it takes 100 people to hold the dam, having 20 people is useless. The dam breaks, everyone dies. Having 99 people is useless. The dam breaks, everyone dies. But having 100 people saves the entire village. It's an all-or-nothing threshold effect.
I see. And when Boorman and Levitt ran their model with that kind of step function, what happened?
They concluded that pure interdemic selection is an improbable event. It requires this narrow window of parameters. And even when it works, the altruist gene usually only gets to about 20 or 30% frequency.
And the cost is huge.
The cost is staggering. To get that result, most of the populations in the system had to go extinct along the way. It's a process defined by massive, widespread failure.
So if we were to summarize the requirements from these models, what are they?
Okay, 1, you need that steep step function extinction curve. 2, you need crazy high extinction rates on the same scale as individual selection. 3, you need a big system broken into lots of small, isolated groups. And 4, even then, you're probably just getting coexistence, not a total victory for altruism.
And the big implication of all this is that Wynne-Edwards' specific ideas about voluntary restraint in huge, stable seabird colonies.
Almost certainly wrong. Those big, stable populations just don't have the high turnover, the constant extinction that the models demand. For those kinds of species, you really have to look to kin selection or individual selection to explain what's going on.
It's clear that pure interdemic selection is a heavy lift, evolutionarily speaking. But are there other ways for group selection to work without all that extinction?
There are. Maynard Smith proposed a model based on segregation and mixing. You don't need extinction. Instead, you have populations that isolate for a while, grow, and then mix back together to form new groups.
But wait, if the selfish individuals are always winning inside the isolated groups, how does the altruism gene not just get diluted to nothing when they all mix?
This is where D.S. Wilson's insight comes in. It's about looking at absolute success, not just relative success. Even if the altruist's relative fitness is lower inside its little group, if its presence makes the group as a whole grow much, much faster,
then that group contributes way more individuals to the big mixing pot later on.
Exactly. The group's overall productivity swamps the local disadvantage of the altruist, so the gene can spread across the whole system.
That feels like a much more plausible mechanism. Now, you also mentioned a kind of dark paradox that can come out of pure group selection.
Yes, the paradox of selfish altruism. This happens in those K-extinction scenarios. If the only goal for the group is to stop growing so it doesn't crash, well, an altruist who just reproduces less is helpful.
Okay.
But an altruist who reproduces less and spends their spare time cannibalizing other members of the group is even more helpful.
Whoa. So a selfish, aggressive act can be good for the group if it keeps the population down.
It's a grim but logical outcome. It just shows how mechanistic and, morally blind these evolutionary forces can be.
All right, let's get back to the real world. The models demand these incredibly high extinction rates. Do we actually see anything like that in nature?
Surprisingly, yes, we do. The theory of island biogeography from MacArthur and Wilson basically showed that high colonization rates must mean high extinction rates for a system to be stable.
And the data from actual islands backs this up?
It does. Think about the island of Krakatoa after it erupted in 1883. It was a blank slate. Birds recolonized, and it reached an equilibrium of about 30 species in 30 years. The models predicted a turnover rate of about 1 species going extinct per year.
It's incredibly fast.
It's very fast. And the experimental work was even more stunning. In the Florida Keys, they took these tiny mangrove islands, fumigated them to kill all the arthropods, and then watched them recolonize. They reached equilibrium in less than a year, and they measured extinction rates of around 3 species per generation. That rate is absolutely in the ballpark of what the models require to power group selection. So while the conditions are strict, they definitely exist in nature.
So since we know the conditions exist, let's look at a couple of classic cases where group selection seems to be the best explanation. The myxonovirus in Australian rabbits is one.
A textbook case. The virus was introduced to control the rabbit population. Now, from an individual virus's point of view, being highly virulent, multiplying really fast is the best strategy.
Yeah.
But if you kill your host rabbit too quickly, before a mosquito can bite it and carry you to another rabbit, your entire lineage dies with that host. The group of super virulent viruses goes extinct.
So interdemic selection favored the less lethal strains.
Right. It favored altruistic viruses that restrain themselves because those were the ones that managed to keep spreading. Over time, the virus evolved to become much less deadly.
The other classic example is in house mice with something called the T locus.
This one is wild.
It is. So mice have these T alleles. If a mouse gets 2 copies, it's either lethal or it makes them sterile. But in males with just 1 copy, something amazing happens. The allele gets into 95% of his sperm.
95%, that's a massive individual advantage. It should be everywhere.
It should be. The models say it should be at like 60 to 95% frequency in the wild, but it's not. It's much lower, around 35 to 50%. So what's holding it back?
Extinction. Mouse populations are often tiny and isolated, with an effective population size of maybe 10 breeding animals. In those tiny groups, that super advantaged allele can quickly go to 100% just by chance.
And if it hits 100% and it's lethal or sterile, when you have 2 copies, the whole population just dies out.
The whole deme goes extinct. The local victory of the selfish gene leads to its complete elimination. So group selection is constantly pruning out the populations where this selfish gene has won, which keeps the average frequency down across the whole system.
Okay, that's a powerful demonstration. Let's shift gears now to the other pole of this whole discussion, kin selection. This seems to be the explanation that pretty much everyone agrees on.
It's the most powerful and well-documented mechanism for altruism, for sure, and it starts with the problem that Darwin himself couldn't initially solve.
The sterile worker insects.
Right. Bees, ants, termites, he called it his one special difficulty. If the workers are sterile, they have 0 offspring. How on earth can the trait for being a sterile worker evolve by individual selection? It's impossible.
And his solution, which was way ahead of its time, was that selection must be happening at the level of the family.
Exactly. If a sterile worker helps her fertile relatives, like the queen, to be more successful, then the trait for producing sterile helpers can spread through the success of the kin who carry that same trait.
It took about 100 years for William D. Hamilton to put the math to that idea, with his concept of inclusive fitness.
Right, in 1964, and this just revolutionizes everything. He said your fitness isn't just about your own kids, it's bigger than that.
So how did he define it?
Inclusive fitness is the sum of your own fitness, your direct reproductive success, plus the sum of all the effects you have on the fitness of your relatives, discounted by how related they are to you.
Okay, so it's about how well the genes you carry do, regardless of whether they are in your body or your brother's body.
That's the core idea. And your relatedness is measured by R, the coefficient of relationship. For siblings, it's a half. For first cousins, it's an eighth, and so on.
This leads to his famous result, Hamilton's rule.
A beautifully simple rule for when altruism can evolve. The condition is that the ratio of the benefit to the recipient, B, to the cost to the actor, C, must be greater than 1 over the coefficient of relatedness, or DC1R.
Let's make that concrete. So imagine an act of altruism costs me my life. So the cost, C, is 1. I'd do this for my brother, where R is a half, so 1 is 2.
Right. For that act of suicidal altruism to be favored by selection, the benefit to your brother has to be more than double your cost. He has to be able to produce more than 2 extra offspring because of your sacrifice. If he only produces 1.9 extra, the gene for that behavior loses out.
And if I do it for my first cousin, where R is an eighth, he'd have to have more than 8 extra offspring to make up for my loss.
Exactly, and that's why the rule is so powerful. It immediately shows you why extreme self-sacrifice is almost always directed at very close kin. The benefit has to be astronomical to make it worthwhile for a distant relative.
And this idea of inclusive fitness doesn't just explain altruism. It can also help us understand things like selfishness and even spite.
It can. I mean, we think of selfishness as always paying off. But if your selfish act harms your relatives too much, it can actually lower your inclusive fitness. Stealing food from your brother might help you, but it could hurt the overall success of your shared genes.
And what about pure spite? Harming yourself just to harm someone else?
True spite, where you take a fitness hit just to hurt another individual, is really hard to evolve. The only way it can work is if hurting that unrelated individual gives a huge compensatory advantage to one of your relatives.
The sources say it's pretty rare in animals, but maybe not in humans.
Right. True spite seems to require a high level of intelligence and social awareness. We're unique in our ability to plot long-term intrigue, to take a small personal hit now in order to diminish a rival family, which in turn promotes our own kin. Our brains make true spite an evolutionarily viable strategy.
Now, Hamilton's rule is amazing, but you mentioned it's considered unstructured. What does that mean?
It's a bit of a technical point, but it's important. The rule is fantastic for telling you if a gene will be favored at a particular moment, but it doesn't include other population genetics parameters like gene frequencies or population size. So it's harder to use it to predict, say, how fast a gene will spread through a real messy population over many generations.
So it's a powerful concept, but it doesn't tell the whole dynamic story.
Exactly. For that, you often need the kind of structure you see in the interdemic models.
Okay, so kin selection explains helping family. But so much of human society is about cooperating with people we're not related to. That brings us to Robert Trivers and his 1971 theory of reciprocal altruism.
Right. Trivers wanted to extend this to non-relatives. The classic example he uses is the Good Samaritan. Someone is drowning. You jump in to save them. It's a risk to you.
You could drown.
You could. But maybe the chance of you drowning is 1 in 10, and the chance of the other person drowning without you is 1 in 2. If you save them, and they are likely to do the same for you later, you've both come out ahead in the long run.
So it's not selfless, it's a trade. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. But the obvious problem is, why not cheat? Why not let someone save you and then just never return the favor?
That's the core instability of the whole system. And Trivers argued that in complex social societies where you interact with the same individuals over and over, selection will act against cheaters. Your reputation is everything.
If you cheat, word gets out and no one ever helps you again.
And you're toast. Your short-term gain is wiped out by long-term losses. And this, he argued, provides an evolutionary origin for a lot of our moral emotions. Well, feelings of moralistic anger or aggression are mechanisms to punish cheaters and keep the system stable. Gratitude and sympathy are signals that you're a reliable cooperator, that you will reciprocate. And guilt. Guilt is fascinating. It's what a cheater feels, motivating them to make amends and prove they can be trusted again.
So these very human feelings are actually adaptations to manage these complex social traits.
They're biological mechanisms favored by selection to make costly cooperation work.
But when you look for this kind of behavior in the animal kingdom, it's pretty rare.
It's almost non-existent outside of a few specific groups. You need a long lifespan, good memory, and stable social groups where you keep running into the same individuals.
So intelligent primates and social hunters.
Exactly. Chimpanzees, baboons, wolves, they form coalitions and alliances that last for years. They can keep track of who owes whom a favor. For most other animals, life is too short or their social world too fluid to support it.
But even for a species that's smart enough, there's a huge problem of just getting it started. What happens to the first Good Samaritan mutant in a world of selfish individuals?
That mutant is a sucker. It goes around saving everyone at a cost to itself, but no one ever saves it in return. Its gene gets hammered by selection. This is what Boorman and Levitt called the critical frequency problem.
So it was a tipping point.
A huge tipping point. They showed that for the system to be stable, the altruism gene has to already be present in the population above a certain critical frequency.
Can you visualize that for us?
Think of it like a steep hill. If the gene is below that critical frequency, it just rolls back down to 0. But if some other force can push it over the top of that hill, then suddenly the chances of interacting with another cooperator are high enough that it pays off.
And then it spreads.
It spreads explosively.
Yeah.
Once it crosses that threshold, it shoots toward fixation. It's an all or nothing game.
So reciprocal altruism needs a kickstart. It can't get going on its own.
It needs help. Maybe that help comes from genetic drift in a really small population, which could push the gene frequency over the threshold by pure chance. Or maybe it comes from kin selection, where the gene was initially favored because you were only cooperating with relatives, and that got it established enough to then work with non-relatives too.
Okay, that gives us our 3 big theories: interdemic, kin, and reciprocal selection. Let's put them to the test now and look at some specific behaviors, starting with the most high-stakes one: dealing with predators.
And the social insects are the place to start because they're a pure product of kin selection. You see the most extreme self-sacrifice there. Termite and ant soldiers are sterile, and their job is basically to die for the colony.
And the honeybee sting is the ultimate example.
It's a perfect example of suicidal altruism. The sting is barbed, but only for use against vertebrates. When a bee stings a mammal, the whole apparatus rips out of its abdomen and the bee dies. That's an adaptation that could only evolve to defend its thousands of closely related sisters in the hive.
For vertebrates, the sacrifice is usually less final, but still very risky. You mentioned dominant male baboons acting as lookouts.
Right. They'll deliberately put themselves in exposed positions to watch for predators, and they'll cover the troops' retreat. This is almost certainly kin defense. That dominant male is very likely the father of most of the young animals he's protecting.
And then you have things like distraction displays in birds.
The classic broken wing display. A parent bird will feign injury, fluttering on the ground to draw a predator away from its nest and its young. It's a huge personal risk, but it's a direct investment in its own offspring, which is just a specific form of kin selection.
All right, let's tackle a famous puzzle. Alarm calls. A small bird sees a hawk and lets out a sharp whistle. Why would it do that? Doesn't that just tell the hawk, hey, lunch is over here?
It's a great question, and what's interesting is that the call itself is acoustically designed to be hard to locate. It's a thin, high-pitched sound, so the bird is trying to warn others while minimizing its own risk. But there's still a risk, so why bother?
There are a few competing ideas, right?
4 main ones. The first 2, that it's just leftover parental care or pure interdemic selection, are pretty unlikely. That leaves the 2 frontrunners.
Hypothesis 3 is kin selection.
Right. In a stable group, your close relatives are probably nearby, so warning them helps your inclusive fitness. This is plausible.
And hypothesis 4 is pure individual selection, that the call actually helps the caller.
This one is really clever. The idea is, if you stay quiet and the hawk successfully kills your neighbor, what happens? The hawk gets fed, it learns that this is a good hunting spot, and it's likely to stick around. By giving a warning, you might cause the hawk to fail and move on, which makes the whole area safer for you in the long run.
So it could be saving your family, or it could be saving your own skin later. It's hard to tell.
It's very hard to tell, and it's probably a mix of both.
We see a similar puzzle with mammals, like gazelles doing that weird stiff leg bouncing called stotting when they see a predator.
Yeah, they seem to be wasting precious time and energy. Again, it could be an altruistic warning. But the most intriguing idea is the pursuit invitation theory.
A pursuit invitation.
The idea is that the gazelle is signaling to the predator. It's saying, I see you. I'm strong and healthy. Don't even bother chasing me. You won't catch me. It's a costly signal, but it might convince the predator to give up before the chase even starts, saving the gazelle even more energy.
Okay, let's move from defense to reproduction, specifically cooperative breeding. Individuals helping to raise young that aren't their own.
This is where we see some of the most spectacular confirmations of Hamilton's rule. The best example comes from the wild turkey.
Tell us about the turkey brotherhoods.
So, groups of brother turkeys will cooperate to court females. They display together. But here's the key. Only the single most dominant brother in the group gets to do any of the mating.
None of the others.
None. The subordinate brothers completely surrender their own personal reproduction. But because they are helping their full brother, who shares half their genes, be massively successful, their inclusive fitness is actually higher than if they had gone off to try and mate on their own and failed.
The math works out.
The math works out perfectly. It's a direct, observable case of Hamilton's rule in action.
We see something similar with Tasmanian hens, where 2 brothers will team up with 1 female.
Right, and those trios raise more chicks than a simple pair does. Again, sibling cooperation increases the total genetic output for all of them.
And this principle goes all the way down to single cells, like in slime molds.
It's amazing. These individual amoebas come together to form a slug, which then turns into a structure that produces spores. But to do that, some of the cells have to sacrifice themselves to form the stalk, allowing the other cells in the sphere at the top to become the spores and reproduce. It's cellular altruism.
Okay, what about food sharing?
In social insects, it's a high art. Honeybees will literally metabolize their own body tissues to produce food for the larvae, shortening their own lives to help raise their younger sisters. That's profound altruism driven by kin selection.
And in mammals, it seems to depend a lot on the social structure.
It really does. Chimpanzees beg and share food, especially meat. They have a system of reciprocity, but baboons are intensely selfish. The dominant males grab all the meat. The difference comes down to their social systems. Chimps have more fluid alliances and reciprocal bonds. Baboons have a rigid dominance hierarchy.
Okay, one last behavioral puzzle. Ritualized combat. Why do animals so often pull their punches? Why do they let a defeated opponent just get up and run away?
It seems like a bad idea, right? You're just letting a rival live to fight you another day. The old good for the species explanation doesn't hold up.
So what's the modern view?
The modern view, which comes from game theory, is that it's actually the best strategy for the individual. Escalating every single fight to the death is just too risky.
You might win, but you're probably going to get seriously injured in the process.
Exactly. An individual who always fights to the death will, over a lifetime, suffer way more injuries than one who accepts a ritualized surrender when they're outmatched or offers mercy when they've won. It's an evolutionarily stable strategy because the long-term cost of constant brutal fighting is just too high. So being merciful is actually the selfishly smart play.
So what we've really established here is that there's no single, simple answer to the evolution of sacrifice. It's a spectrum of different mechanisms.
That's the main takeaway. We've mapped out the three main routes: interdemic selection, kin selection, and reciprocal altruism.
And we've seen that pure group selection is possible, but it needs these really extreme conditions, high turnover, threshold effects that are pretty rare.
While kin selection is just incredibly powerful and robust, explaining the most extreme forms of self-sacrifice. And then reciprocal altruism is this powerful tool for non-relatives, but it has that huge hurdle of getting started in the first place.
So at the end of all this, what does this framework mean for us? For humans, the most social creatures on the planet.
I think the biggest implication is that this theory predicts ambivalence. It predicts conflict. We are the product of all these competing forces. There's a constant tension between what's best for us as individuals, what's best for our family, and what's best for our tribe.
So that feeling of being torn between irreconcilable loyalties, that's baked into our biology.
It's the core of the human ethical dilemma. We're always trying to make these imperfect choices. And Wilson's final provocative thought is that sociobiology, when combined with neuroscience, might one day give us a real scientific explanation for the origin of ethics. It could explain why we are wired to make certain moral choices.
That is a profound thought to end on, to think about the deep evolutionary genetic math that might be running behind your next moral decision. Thank you for joining us for this really extensive deep dive into the forces of sacrifice and cooperation.
We hope you're leaving this feeling fully informed about the complex world of group survival. We'll see you next time.